In the previous video, we've created this app class, and if you try to load the page in a browser, by now you would see this fatal error, uncalled type error, argument 1 passed to app method must be instance of controller, instance of page controller given. Now what's happening here? Let's quickly go back to our editor and have a look at the app. So first of all, we're obtaining the controller name with a namespace. So let's go to this controller method, and controller method first takes argument from the segment from the request. And if we go back to the browser, we obviously don't have anything. We only have the domain name. So we don't have any indication of what controller we should have here. So going back to our editor, so that would mean that we are within the empty section here. So this empty controller would evaluate to true. In other words, we would override this controller with the login. So then we pass this login to this controller name, and controller name, what it does, it simply converts whatever we got from the URI into the class name. And I've just noticed that I've forgotten to actually append here controller to this class name, because when we pass, in this instance, it would be just a lowercase login. So we're passing this as an argument here. So that will be converted using this hyphen to class name to the login, but we obviously need to append the controller as well, because all our controllers will have controller at the end. So login controller is what this controller is going to add to this login. So that's what we would return. So that's what we are going to obtain here. So at this point, we have login controller. Then we prepend the namespace to this login controller. And because we do have login controller, now this message should change. So the problem that was here originally was referring to the fact that we didn't have appended this controller. So now this page controller will change to login controller. Look, I'm refreshing, as you can see. It tells me that obviously we still have a problem, but this time rather than page controller, it's a login controller because it's loading this login controller. But what happens if we now, because obviously we're returning instance of this login controller, but if we open login controller, it does not extend this controller yet. So when we are actually, if we just go up here, passing this controller instance to the method, which expects the controller, this obviously login controller does not represent the controller because it doesn't extend it, or it doesn't implement any contract with the name of controller either. Okay, so what we need to do first is extend the controller from here. There we go, app controller. If we save it, go back to the browser, refresh the page, and now we have a blank page. Now, why do we have a blank page? Well, if we have a look at this, we're checking for the method here. So we get in the segment to obviously returning empty string or null, and that obviously evaluates to true, at which point we overwriting this method variable with index, and then we get the method name, which will just return index because there's no concatenations with any hyphens or anything like this in the URL. This is just a straight lowercase string. So that's going to be the name of the method. And if method doesn't exist, controller on this controller, then this exception is thrown. And obviously from within our, if we go back to the render, we're catching this exception with the error controller. So error controller has this index method, which we are calling from within this app here. And then we pass the message to it as argument. But from within error controller, we don't do anything. So that's why we see the blank page. If I was to say return message, if we go back to the browser, and there we go, this is what we get here. Invalid method call app controllers login controller index. And this is because obviously we don't have index method on the login controller yet. So let's go back to the login controller and let's quickly create this method. So public function index. And for the time being, I'm just going to return hello from within login controller, just so we know that it's loaded correctly. So if we now refresh, there we go. We know that we obviously loaded the index method on the login controller. So that all works fine. Okay, we can, for now, let's just close this index because we're going to get back to this a little bit later on. Our app is now fixed as well, obviously, because we've forgotten this. I've forgotten this controller after the name of the controller name. So we can close this class as well. Let's open the controller class. And what we're going to do here, I'm going to start with the new construct. So new construct. It will take several arguments. The first one is going to be blade, and the second one is going to be container. And let's bind them to our properties. Let's create these properties straight away. There we go. Now they should probably be protected so we can access them from any subclasses. So that's the first thing we're going to do. And next, what we're going to do is to create another property. This guard equals container make guard. And how do we get this? Let's just add this property, and I'm going to show you in a moment where it comes from. Protected guard, and it's going to represent not mixed, that is a guard instance. Our utilities app utilities guard. If we just move it down here, package is separate from our own components. So that's the guard. And where is this guard coming from? If we open our public index.php, you may remember that I bound here this guard instance of a guard. At the moment, it's just an empty class. We will work with this later on. So basically, when we are calling this make method on the container, we are getting the instance of this guard that we bound here to this container. So that's what happens basically on this line. Okay, and then next one is going to be this request, because we're going to be using this quite often. So let's straight away have the property ready, container make request, and that's exactly the same thing as with the guard, but obviously here we have instance of the request. And the last thing we're going to do is call the method this constructor. This is the method that will allow us to add any additional constructor actions that we want to add to the main constructor, rather than calling parent constructor from within any of the controllers. We just basically override this constructor method, and by default this method is going to be empty, so I'm just going to put it all in line. By default, nothing's going to be executed within this method. So let's add some doc blocks here for the controller. We're going to add params, param blade, and then we have param container. And for the constructor, here we're going to say add to parent constructor, and then return void. So basically, why am I doing this way? Have a look at this. If we, let's say, from within the error controller would like to have a constructor here as well, we would have to do something like this: new constructor, and then again we would have to put in these dependencies and then pass these dependencies to the parent constructor. So parent constructor construct, then blade container, and so on. But I don't want to do this. I just want to have a simple method which is automatically appended to the existing constructor of the parent class. So that's why we have this constructor. Now if I want to add something to the constructor, I only call this method, obviously where I've made it private, obviously wrong, it should be protected, so that we can actually access it from any subclasses. And again, let's extend controller here from within the error controller. So now what I could do is simply use protected function constructor and just add whatever I want here. And if I want to add any verification or authentication to check, restrict access to the page, for instance, I can just do it straight away from here. And this is going to be run right after the constructor has processed all these items. This method will be called basically whatever we have within this method. So that's a little bit easier and cleaner. We don't have to obviously call the parent constructor and pass all these arguments that are required for this specific constructor. Okay, so that's our controller, just the beginning of our controller. The next thing I want to do here is to add the view method, so that we can actually return the view from within all of our controllers. So protected function, we call it view, and it will take 3 arguments. First one is a view. By default, it's going to be null, then data, which is data that we want to pass to the view, and then the last one is the merge data, which is the argument that comes by default with Illuminate views, basically the views that you would use with a blade within Laravel. So return this blade and then view and we pass all these arguments in the same order. So view, data, and then merge data. Let's add some doc blocks. There we go. Let's import these views here, these classes, factory, there we go, and get view instance. So that's what this view method will do. Now, going back to our error controller, I'm going to remove these spaces. And what I'm going to do here now is return this view, and then I'm going to pass the view which I want to use. And if we go to our resources, we have views, we have pages, and there is this arrow blade. If we open it, it's basically using arrow and then the message within the square brackets, which we need to obviously change. But let's first indicate that this is the view that we actually want to return. So view points to the views directory. And how do I know this? Because if you go back to the index.php, that's where we specify it as. This views variable, real path to the directory where our index.php is. So it's public. Then from this directory, we went out to the root of our project. Then we went to resources and then to the views. So this instance at this point here, this view already knows that it needs to fetch files from this views directory. So what we need to do now here to indicate which file we want to fetch is just add pages and then arrow. We don't need to add .blade to it. It will automatically append it, so don't worry about this. I'm just putting a semicolon at the end here. So this view is going to be fetched and returned, and with method will allow us to pass some arguments to this view, message, and the message will be basically whatever we've received as an argument. By default, let's set it to null as well, because we may not have any message there. So that's what we pass into our view. Now, if we open this arrow blade file, and what we need to do now is wrap our message within a set of 2 curly brackets, something like this, and then the name of the variable message, which comes from this with method. So this is how we want to call our variable, and that's how we're passing this through. Basically, this is the content. This is how we want to go to refer to it within our view. And you can read more about Blade's templating engine if you go to laravel.com, then documentation, and on the left hand side you'll find Blade's template link, and this is the whole specification, so you can read through how you can create your templates, how you can display data, how you can include other files, and so on. There's lots and lots of information here. Okay, let's go back to our project. However, refresh the page. We're obviously still on the login page, but if I put something that we don't have as a controller, let's say some error, and then let's add because if I just run it like this, it's going to call the page controller. And obviously page controller, if we go back to our editor, if I open page controller, you'll see that we still obviously don't extend the controller. That's why it's failing. So extends controller. And if I go back now, refresh the page, now it displays the error page, as you can see, with the message that I've put through as an argument. And it tells me that invalid method call on the page controller, we don't have index method. And as you can see, it's automatically displaying this in the correct view, because obviously I've prepared all these views together with the exercise file, so you don't have to play with this. Now extends, it just tells you which templates we are using, templates, and the template is within, as you can see, template layout. Again, it's pointing to the views automatically, and then from views, where is your template. So we go into the template directory, and then we have layout.blade. And again, we don't have to append .blade here. And this is the entire template. If you want to modify it in any way, obviously you can do it. Yield method, it tells me where I want my content to be put. In this case, content, because I've used the content as well here. So now I can use the section and wrap the content that I want to put in between this div tags here into this content section. So section, content, my content, and then to end this section to indicate that the section is closing now, just end section tag, and that's all going to be replaced here in this place. So that's it. But again, as I said, go to laravel.com and read about Blade's templating a little bit more if you obviously want to learn more about it. Okay, so our error page is now done. Let's just add some dog block here, perhaps, for this index method. And it, rather than returns this, it's going to return illuminate view. That's the one. So illuminate view. That's what we're returning here. Message which might be null, and then index controller. Now, one thing before we wrap it up, let's just open .env file. And what I'm going to do, if we go back to our browser, refresh the page, we still see this message. But now if I change this to live environment, look what's going to happen. We go back, refresh the page, and then we get this default message. So if it's in live environment, obviously we don't want users to know exactly what methods, what classes we have, or any other sensitive information that could be displayed in the browser. We want them just to know that obviously there is some problem. We're going to deal with it. Okay, let's go back to where it was, which was local. Refresh the page, and again we see the exact message that we want to see, because obviously this tells us exactly what the problem is. There's one last thing that we need to do with our error controller. Now, if I open my developer tools in Chrome and reload this page, you'll see that even though it is actually 404, it should display 404, the response that I'm getting is 200. The status here is 200, which is okay, which is not right, obviously, because it's not 200. It's not okay. It's 404. So if we go back to our editor, one thing we need to do before we actually return this view, let's use the HTTP underscore response code and put in 404, so that the header with 404 status code is returned. So if we now save it and refresh the page, you can see now it's returning the correct status code. 404 not found. So that's it in this video. Let's move to the next one.